Bienvenidos and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for ARTE HORA, a program conceived as part of El Museo's ongoing El Museo en Tu Casa initiative. I'm curator Susanna Temkin, and I'm really thrilled to be the moderator of today's conversation, Felicidades, Carmen, which is being held in honor of Carmen Herrera's upcoming 105th birthday. Just really momentous. So thank you for joining us tonight to be here to celebrate. Tonight, we're going to be hearing from Carmen's friends, her peers, curators, and scholars. Just before we begin, and to help optimize your experience, we suggest that you select the speaker view so that you can see all of the images that we're going to present. We'll also be muting our audience members, and we ask you to please remain on mute. But if you have any questions, or also if you want to send any well wishes to Carmen, we can try and get them to her using the chat function. Let's see. Is everyone seeing the PowerPoint?
No.
Let's see, one moment as we await.
No, right now we're seeing the Zoom screen.
I'm afraid we're seeing someone else's screen. Here we are. We're back to Carmen. So, on that note, I just wanted to say this is going to be what I hope is a casual conversation. We've already been chatting a bit, and it's going to be, I think, very interesting. But I do want to give at least brief introductions to our participants. You received more thorough bios with the invitation today. First, we have Tony Bechara, an artist, neighbor, and very close friend of Carmen with us. We have Carolina Ponce de Leon, a curator who's worked in the US and in Colombia, and she's one of my esteemed predecessors here at El Museo. So I'm very happy to be meeting you virtually, Carolina. And we'll be talking about your show of Carmen's in 1998. And we also have Monica Espinel with us, a scholar and independent curator who authored the very thorough chronology that appears in the Whitney Museum's exhibition catalog and covers 100 years of Carmen's life. So you have five more years to go now, Monica, and is a real expert on her career. Just to begin, I have a brief confession to make, in that I think I'm the only one on this panel who hasn't met Carmen personally, sadly. But I'm really lucky at El Museo to be able to work with her paintings. We have two amazing works in the collection, Red on Red from 1959 and Diptych from 1978. And I hope you all had the chance to see Red on Red recently as part of the 50th anniversary exhibition that we held last year, Culture and the People. And I wanted to show you this gallery view. On the left, you see Carmen Herrera, you see a work by Ivelisse Jimenez, another artist working in abstraction. And sort of facing off against Carmen is a work by Tony Bechara. So sort of in the spirit of maybe initial encounters, I wanted to ask if we could begin by asking each of our participants, how did you first meet Carmen or come into contact with her work? Tony, do you wanna start?
Yeah, well, yes, 10 years ago, I had known Carmen for 40 years. So I don't want to say that I know her for 50 years, but I know her for close to 50 years. I met her in 1970. Monica probably knows better. I think it's 74 at a Loeb Student Center exhibit. An exhibit called 12 Latin Americans. That was the concept. And I walked in and hung my painting and turned to the side, and I saw what seemed to me an elderly couple at the time, trying to hang this marvelous piece of art. And I was taken aback by the work, and then I looked at them, and they were trying to, because it's a complicated, it was one of the estructuras. Actually, it was the one that is on the cover of the Whitney catalog, Amarillo. And I went over and I helped them. And we started speaking, and she being Cuban, I was from Puerto Rico. Jesse was very fluent in Spanish, French, German, and many other languages. And it turned out that I had just moved to 19th Street. And so it turned out that we were neighbors. And that's how we met and became friends and neighbors for many, many years.
Well, I think hopefully we'll be returning to what I think is like a 19th Street group that you all belong to. But before going on, Carolina, do you want to, how did you first meet Carmen?
Well, when I was at El Museo, I became a curator in 1996. And Tony was on the board of directors of El Museo at that moment. And Tony introduced me to her work and introduced me to Carmen. And I think Tony can tell me if this is true, but I have the idea that the possibility of doing a show of Carmen's work at El Museo had been part of a conversation that had been going on for many, many years. And for some reason, just hadn't happened.
Uh-oh.
Let's see.
Carolina is frozen.
What?
Oh, you're back.
I'm
Carmen.
frozen?
No, you're back. You're back.
I'm not frozen. And so we went to the studio with Tony, and that's when I was introduced at the same time to Carmen's work and to Carmen. And that was an extraordinary event because on one hand, Carmen has like this very precise work, to a certain degree, austere. And she herself she's someone who's is so smart and so, verbally intelligent that she makes these very strong opinionated statements about anything that has to do with herself, with art, with the art world, with the city, with politics. And so it was absolutely fascinating to just meet her and see such a strong woman who had been completely poorly acknowledged by the art world that she belonged to.
And I know, well, we have a lot more to talk about as far as the exhibition that you ultimately produced in 1998. But before we go on, Monica, I wonder if you could share your experience. And I'm also you're the author of the chronology. And so we're really grateful to you for sharing all these amazing archival images with us that we're seeing today.
Sure, thank you for the invitation. I actually met Carmen in 2007 when I was the director of a gallery called Latin Collector that used to be on 57th Street. And she was one of the artists who was represented by the gallery. And actually Tony was another of the artists who was also on the roster. And together with Tony, we decided to do a solo show of her estructuras, which had never happened before. And I had the chance to meet her then. And thereafter, we continued working with her on the show that she had at Icon. And then I was lucky enough to be invited to write the chronology for the show at the Whitney. And I think that over the years, it's now been 13 years, it's incredible to see how Carmen's reputation has just continued to grow. And I think it's now a fact that she's going to be a part of the canon for geometric abstraction, and that her recognition came late but arrived, and it's beautiful to see that she's still around to see it.
Yeah, it's pretty, I mean, I was reading, and it seems like such a strong statement, but someone writes that she is the artist who has been working in geometric abstraction longer than any other, and it kind of took me aback, but it has to be true over her extensive career. So Monica, the image that we're seeing here, this is an image that you provided to us of Carmen as a very young girl in Cuba. She is the little girl with the bow on her hair. And I'm just gonna start clicking through some of the images you shared, but I know that you wanted to speak about how her career has really extended throughout her life, how you can see some threads throughout.
Yes, definitely. This is a photograph from when She was about 2 or 3, and it's a picture of her and her siblings. And it's to show maybe, I think, one of the things that made her have so much grit throughout her life was being the little one of 7 siblings. Is something that I've thought a lot about myself. And then also the fact that she lost her father when she was only 2. And she was raised by her mother, who was an incredible pioneer in Cuba. She was a journalist, she was an editor, and she was also an author and philanthropist. So I think she gets a lot of the power in her work through people like her mom and also her sister, who was a well-known diplomat, and actually during World War II was an air warden and the Cuban attaché in London. So one of the most beautiful things that I got access to when I was looking through the archives was actually the letters between her and her sister, Rosa. It was incredible to see the exchanges and be able to read about that time in the first person.
And we were speaking earlier about the fact that Carmen has lived through, well, 2 pandemics, the Spanish flu and now coronavirus. And you mentioned some of the war efforts of her sister, but I saw in your chronology also that Carmen herself was contributing to creating parachute silks for a time during World War II. And I thought that was interesting too, thinking about how, you know, a lot of artists today, or some artists, are helping with the coronavirus effort as far as making masks. And
yeah, actually what she was doing was she was hand painting silk ties that were made from parachute scraps.
I see. Oh, well, that's slightly different.
It is. And sadly, that job was very short-lived because there was a fire that burned down the factory. But in that job, she met her lifelong friend, Flora, who was a singer of Sephardic ballads from Jewish lands. And they were very, very close, and they used to hold salons together. That I was able to get information from a niece of hers, of Flora's.
Mm-hmm. And one of these images that we're seeing here is Carmen with Jesse, who Tony already mentioned, getting to meet at the 1939-1940 New York World's Fair. So we should point out that Carmen, I guess, came to New York for love as early as 1939. And though she spent time in Paris, she ultimately settled here in the 50s, but she's been here all the way since then.
If I may add on that point, that is actually quite critical to her development. People assume that because of her, the style of her work, that she really is a person that came to New York in the 50s after Paris. She came to New York in 39. She came to New York actually before the abstract expressionists were reigning. I mean, it was at the time in which they were starting to become known. Coming to New York in 39, spending the war years here. She remembers the tickets that you used to get a certain amount of meat a week and all of that, and the blackouts. And that is fundamental to know, because that's when she landed in New York with Jesse, who was an awesome individual, a human being, a real mensch, an intellect, a linguist, a philosopher, a great teacher, and whose friends were people like Barney Newman, people like Mark Rothko, people like the poet Louis Sukovsky, who was the beginning of concrete poetry. And you can imagine Carmen coming from Havana, her English probably not as good as it is now, being in that milieu until 1948. So from 39 to 48, she lands in New York, and she's listening to the likes of Barnett Newman and having brunch with Anna Lee and Barney every Sunday. They were neighbors. Then they go to Paris. 48, they go to Paris. And Carmen, all of a sudden, is she has a studio to begin with in Paris. So all of a sudden, this woman that had been kind of sitting in awe of all these titans that she was meeting in New York, intellectual titans, comes to Paris, and she and Jesse are on the same level. They were both in Paris as unknowns, and Paris was fundamental. Not only she discovers herself as an artist, but also as an independent woman. She has her own studio. Her friends are incredible. Jean Genet was a friend of hers. During those Paris years, Marie Raymond, who nobody remembers now, but she's better known now because she was the mother of Yves Klein. Marie Raymond and Frederick Klein were her neighbors. Those years in Paris were crucial. Her involvement with the Réalité Nouvelle movement. So then she comes to New York in '53. And that's when she hits the wall, because she had been progressing, she had been part of movements, she had exhibited every year at the Réalité Nouvelle, and she arrives back in New York and meets a wall of silence. And that's when New York was being dominated by the machos of the abstract expressionist movement, by the brawling and hard drinking Pollock, de Kooning, who was also a friend. And so not enough has been said about that formative part of her trajectory. I think Monica probably knows more about that also, because she followed it in the archives. She is, to this day, she talks with great sentiment about her years in Paris. And also she talks with great sentiment about that exhibition at Museo del Barrio in '98 that Carolina put together.
Yes.
She thinks it was the best exhibit that she's ever had.
And we're getting to that very quickly. But Monica, do you want to expand a little bit more about Paris or about her return to New York before we?
Well, in Paris, she was very good friends with Wilfredo Lam. I mean, to know Carmen as I have known her, my fascination with our relationship has always been, I am a lover of history. And to me, Carmen was a direct contact first of all, her character is formed in the 19th century because her parents were people of the 19th century. They were born in the 1800s. They were journalists. They were. Her father fought in the
Spanish American
in the Cuban Revolution. He fought on the Cuban side. His father fought on the Spanish side, and they never spoke to each other for a long time. Her father was wounded during the Revolutionary War. We're talking now 1898. So you can imagine that while Carmen was born 15 or 16 years later, her foundation, her intellectual structure, her ethical standards were all from the 19th century. And she knew Amelia Pelaez, who she admired greatly, even though Amelia Pelaez was considerably older, maybe 15 years older than Carmen. And while she was in Havana, she was a very active artist, good friends with Wilfredo Lam and with all the others, intellectual people of that time. Her main interest at that time was architecture. And she went to the university to study architecture. But it was the time of Machado. It was the time when Batista was trying to overthrow Machado. And there were constant strikes and revolts in the university. So the university was hardly open. She studied architecture because 5 or 6 friends got together and they used to follow what was going on in Europe through magazines. They knew about the Bauhaus. They knew about National Socialism. They knew about the Nazis. And one of Carmen's earlier pieces is a Christ done in caoba, mahogany, done on a swastika. This is 1936.
37.
37.
It's 1937, but we have an image of it, so maybe we can pull it up.
So we will excuse the whiplash because it's towards the end of this this
Okay.
program, but
Anyway, when it comes up, it comes up.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that Carmen is considered sort of the spirit behind that exhibition, and that it was a very sort of avant-garde initiative that she started because it was in protest of not having enough exhibition spaces in Cuba for art. And it was her together with 5 other artists, and each one had 5 artworks, and it was done in the Parque Alvear, which is a very central park in Havana.
Outdoors.
Outdoors, and some of the paintings were actually hanging from the trees. Not everything was on a pedestal. And the work that Tony was mentioning, the Christ on the swastika, you can actually see on the bottom right of this image, and it's a Christ carved out of mahogany on top of the, oops, I lost it. There it is. Which I think is very telling of how politically minded she has always been, and how against any kind of racism or intolerance she's always been. And the fact that 2 years later she marries Jewish man from the Bronx who was German Jewish is also telling, given that she was raised as a Roman Catholic woman, even though in a very sort of intellectually rich environment. She was Roman Catholic, and that at the time was pretty audacious, let's say.
Definitely. And also, I mean, her parents were founders of a newspaper, El Mundo. It was a newspaper that was closed by Fidel later on, but it was an important, her father's name was Nieto, her grandfather, or her father, I'm sorry.
Her mother.
Carmen Nieto.
Carmela. Carmela was
Carmela Nieto.
Yeah.
That's right.
My mother's name is Nieto too.
That's why I'm bringing it up, Carolina, because also from the newspaper world. I mean, your grandmother or your grandfather were also newspaper people.
Yes.
well,
Journalist also.
Well, I mean, it's so striking for me, at least, to see some of her early work, this sculptural work. And I think we're going to talk later about her sort of more recent return to sculpture with some of her estructuras monumentales. So this is maybe a preview of what I hope we talk to later. But to get back to how does she make the shift from this sculptural practice to the paintings that we, like a painting like we're seeing here, this 1965 painting Beacon, which I believe here is shown on its side or in a different orientation than it's presented in the exhibition catalog. So how does that process happen, Monica?
So I think that it's important to think of Carmen in terms of something that might sound a little funny right now, but in terms of contagion. I think she was in rapport with a lot of artists from all moments. So she uses a quote by Leonardo da Vinci, for example, for her first solo show catalog. And then she is highly inspired by somebody from the 17th century, like Francisco de Zurbarán, all the way through her contemporaries who were doing and participating in the Salon de Réalité Nouvelle alongside with her. But I think what's really beautiful is to see how during the Paris years, there is really huge amount of experimentation. And you have to think that she's still in her early 30s at this point, and yet she's dealing with organic abstraction, with more gestural abstraction, which she gets into when she actually travels to Havana to visit her mother in 1950 and 1951. So she's really trying to find a language of her own, and little by little starts to really focus on the line and sort of those dichromatic compositions that she becomes so famous for. And it's really important to see the earlier works to be able to get a sense of how much she really experimented to be able to get to that language, which is what she's known for.
Also, it reminds me that she has always said that, that all or most of her paintings, especially like the green and white series, the very geometric, the very minimalist work, she always refers to them as sculptures trying to be born.
Mm-hmm.
She just couldn't afford it. And this is terribly important. She didn't have the wherewithal or the means to make the sculptures. She had a friend who was a retired dentist or doctor, I'm not quite sure, who as a hobby was a carpenter. And he was able to construct those first pieces in 1969, 70, 68, 72, Amarillo and all of that, the first estructuras. But unfortunately he died. And at that moment, they just could not afford a fabricator, they could not afford. But for me, when she came back from Paris, she wanted to be a sculptor. She wanted, and she drew, and I think that Dana Miller really got it right when she referred to the shapes in her abstract paintings as slices, or as, what was the term that she used? Like cutouts.
Sight lines.
Hmm?
Sight lines.
Yeah, and if you look at some of those paintings and then you look at the estructuras, you see the obviousness of the relationship. And I feel that when she came back from Paris, and when she did those pieces and wanted to do those pieces, this is where I think that she should have been included in the so-called American movement of minimalism. Okay. There was a Cuban in that movement. She just was totally ignored. But she really belonged with, and not only belonged, but was earlier on than many of them. She was there with Mangold and Judd and Irving, many of them, Stella, and unfortunately did not get the recognition at the time.
Well, perhaps we can zoom ahead to talk a little bit about the show that El Museo had in 1998. So we're really proud to always boast that we had this show, some 20 years before the Whitney, although I have to admit she wasn't so young already at this time. And I think a lot of what we've been talking about, this distillation of her language from sculpture through her early paintings, in some ways this show, it's the focus on the black and white paintings, maybe the most, quote unquote simple, the most, reduced to just these two colors. So I want to ask Carolina, why did you do this exhibition? What was going on in your mind at the time when you were curating at El Museo that made you, say this was time for Carmen to have the show? And why this show?
Okay, I think that before speaking specifically about the show, I think it's important to understand a bit what the cultural dynamics were at the time, because the 1990s were a really important decade in the development of the new paradigms to frame art from Latin America, and that were challenging all the Eurocentric perspectives that were dominating art historical discourse at the time. And it may not seem so, I mean, because today Latin American art moves very comfortably in the mainstream circuits, but the process to get there, in other words, to be accepted and to be legitimized as an artist, was to some degree a very slow one. At the closing of the 1980s, there was this exhibition that was called The Art of the Fantastic. The art historian who introduced that exhibition was Edward Lucy Smith. And it was a survey exhibition of Latin American art, which seemed to like wrap up the exoticist discourse that was being used to frame art from Latin America. See, and so what was interested to these curators and the terms in which Latin American art was presented was in its associations with Baroque aesthetics, with exuberance, with color, with all these things that have to do with a stereotypical image of what Latin American culture is. And so in the early 1990s, there was a paradigm shift that happened. And the whole generation of curators and academics from Latin America began to challenge this kind of magical realist framing. And they did so by organizing exhibitions that disputed, these exoticizing categories that had been established by shows, such as The Art of the Fantastic. And some of the most relevant exhibitions that happened, like at the beginning of the 1990s, in American exhibition museums and in Europe, were, for example, and that were curated by Latin American curators. They include Ante America, which is an exhibition that I curated together with Gerardo Mosquera and Rachel Weiss. The Bleeding Heart, which was an exhibition that was curated by Olivier Debras, who was a French expatriate and art historian critic who was based in Mexico City. And Cartographies, which was an exhibition curated by the Brazilian curator, Ivo Mesquita. And all of these survey exhibitions were produced in the early 1990s. And they created a sort of frame to understand Latin American art, not in terms of any kind of cultural subordination to what was happening with art movements in Eurocentric art movements happening in New York and Paris, London, etc. And so there are also, besides these survey exhibitions, we did a beautiful exhibition also, I think it was either 1997 or 1998 at el Museo del Barrio. It was this exhibition curated by Maria Carmen Ramirez. It was called Realigning Vision, which was an exhibition of contemporary Latin American drawing that went from very experimental concepts of drawing to more traditional forms. And all of these like group exhibitions were really creating what was considered at the time the Latin American art boom. And so besides that, and together almost at the same time as that was happening, the art market, the Latin American art market also began to boom. And so it's interesting to know that in 1998, when we had the show of Carmen Herrera, the Latin American art sales at Christie's had already boomed to, I think they were making like $27 million a year. Whereas when they started the Latin American art department at Christie's in the 80s, their sales were like at around 2.5 million. So you can see that really Latin American art was having a really strong, support system pushing it as an important and hot commodity, right? So together with this combination of art historical discourse, cultural studies, debate, and this booming art market, it seemed as though there was a Latin American art renaissance taking place. And I'd like to point out that at the time, the Latin American artists who were being discovered, by the international art world tended to have an economic and promotional infrastructure in their countries of origin of, museums, galleries, collectors, local art markets that supported their inclusion into the mainstream circuits. And I think this is an important fact in relation to Carmen Herrera's lack of recognition at the time, because she didn't have these support systems to advance her work, to show her work. So the reason why I'm referring to this context in order to speak about Carmen Herrera is because I want to highlight, some of the complexities of that moment, and to explain that from my perspective, when I decided to curate her show at El Museo, I did so in light of the fact that her work had been unjustly excluded from the international art history of, geometric abstraction or hard edge abstraction, to which she not only belonged, but in many ways of which she was a pioneer. But also she was excluded from the Latin American art world, which most likely because she was formed as an artist in contexts that were separated from the Cuban and the South American art worlds. As Tony mentioned right now, her strongest affiliations in art were rooted in Paris. I mean, when Carmen was living in Paris, she was surrounded by very important art figures, and she was actively participating as an artist within the art scene. Whereas when she moved to New York, she had very few art exhibitions, though she did have, her artist friends, but she was more excluded. So I think that has a lot to say of how patriarchal the art world, the New York art world was in the 1950s and 60s. And so when I became a curator at El Museo del Barrio in 1996, the museo had, recently redefined its mission to go beyond its original geopolitical focus on the art and culture from Puerto Rico to a more inclusive Latin American mission. And thanks to Susanna Temkin, I was invited to implement this new vision. And since I had moved recently to New York from Colombia, I was still unaware of all of these tensions and complexity that involved these relations between the US and the Latin American art worlds. And that quickly changed. So one of my main goals was to, design an exhibition program that would both advance and challenge these different dynamics that I just mentioned in hopefully the most creative and productive ways. And so I established this exhibition series that we called FOCO, which consisted primarily of solo exhibitions of mid to advanced career artists in order to advance scholarship and to bring visibility to artists who had had a solid and mature body of work, yet were under-recognized. And in the case of Carmen Herrera, she was under-recognized, as I mentioned before, both by the international art world, as well as by the Latin American art world, because her work didn't fit into the narratives that were being advanced at that moment. And so as a result, she was unfortunately being ignored by everybody. And, it was surprising, like when after I visited, the studio with Tony and we saw her work and I met Carmen, I realized like she's this person that's larger than life. Well, I decided that it was very important to show her work. I personally have been very interested in showcasing artists who have not been in the focus of history, to make these historical corrections when possible. And so I've done a series of exhibitions like that throughout my career. But I was very interested in in looking at Carmen's work, a body of work. Carmen was 80, I think, at the time when we did the exhibition. So it was, there was an extraordinary body of work from which to choose from and decide how to organize this. And that's how the idea of doing the black and white series, the black and white paintings, which are not a series, but to do a collection, because it was a discrete body of work, the black and white series. And what's interesting about the black and white paintings is that Carmen would work in series of colors, and sort of like when you eat ginger when you're having Japanese food and you eat ginger between one dish and another to cleanse your palate. Well, she would do this with the black and white paintings. So she would have this period of time where she would paint in color and then stop. And the black and white paintings would have like the essence of what her artistic vision was about. And that's why I thought it was beautiful to do this, because in itself, the black and white series covered from 1951, which was her first artwork in black and white, to 1989. So this is an enormous, this expands an enormous amount of time. And at the same time, it's one specific view of this work. And one of the other reasons why I want to just add one little thing more of why the black and white paintings is because one of the things that I found most astounding about her history was the fact that she did pioneer, or at least was simultaneous to work that Frank Stella had done. And I thought that one of the things that the art world has historically been unjust about is giving women their place in history. And so I thought that that showing the black and white paintings was a very strong way of positioning this her body of work within a larger art historical perspective.
I'd like to interject there because I have a personal anecdote, and I think it's worthy of sharing, because when I was doing my MA at Hunter College, I took a class called Research Methods. And the premise was to write a paper and work on it throughout the entire semester on an artist that was currently on view in one of the main three museums in New York. So the Guggenheim, the Met, or the Moma. And I was lucky enough that there was actually a Carmen Herrera on view at the time. It was 2010 at Moma. And so I petitioned to write my paper about Carmen, and the professor, whom I will not name, rejected my petition and said, no, you should write about Ellsworth Kelly instead, because there is not enough information about Carmen for you to actually be able to do research on her. So it's kind of to point into sort of the inherent flaws in the field and how important it is to stand your ground and try to really bring to the fore these sort of forgotten voices. And she's not the only one. I think that there are women all over. I can name Judith Marquez in Colombia or Regina Prijaskis in Peru, women who contributed enormously to abstraction and who have yet to have a true sort of investigation in depth of the work.
So did you do the thesis on Kelly?
I did. I actually wrote about Colors for a Large Wall, which is a work that he made while he was in Paris. And it was interesting because it did give me a lot of context about the international sort of mixes that were happening in Paris at the time, because it was the post-war period and a lot of them were on sabbaticals there. And so it was a very important contextual sort of exercise for me in terms of Carmen's work itself. But I think it would have been much more of a worthy effort to actually use Carmen, because it could have been, you know, first-person accounts, oral history, and actually employ research methods that would be very sort of generous for art history and not just regurgitating what had already been said about Kelly.
And again, I'm sorry for jumping around, but one of the things to be thinking about the black and white work specifically is, you know, as I was looking through your exhibition catalog, which I guess would have been a wonderful resource for you, Monica, had you been allowed to do that paper. It was really striking to me to see how many of the works that were on the wall at El Museo, they were all still with Carmen at the time. And now those same works are, you know, in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. They're in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. And it's amazing to think that not so long ago, you know, they were part just with Carmen. And I wanted to also mention that the show, I think it received very high praise. Holland Cotter said, quotes, Carmen Herrera occupies an honorable place in post-war geometric painting, and this fine show should help to secure it. And I wanted to ask all three of you.
Is that from the Museo exhibition?
Yes.
This is the Museo exhibition. And so I wanted to ask all three of you, you know, how do you react to a quote like this when we see still, you know, another 20 years goes by before the Whitney. On the other hand, I mean, as Monica and I were discussing back and forth as we prepared for this, I mean, there is a lot of mythology around Carmen Herrera, and the discovery of her happens, I think, many times, long before 2016 at the Whitney. So I'm curious what you think about some of those myths.
So I think one of the most beautiful things that I found in her archive when I was doing the research for the Whitney catalog was actually a handwritten interview that she had conceded in 2005. And one of the snippets that I most recall is in handwriting, Carmen's writing. She writes about the fact that the first paintings she sold was when she was 19 in Havana to American tourists. So I think it's important to dispel the myth that she never sold a painting until she was 89 or in 2004. I think throughout her life, she was doing solo shows intermittently, participating enormously in group shows. And it's important also to rescue the fact that she was active throughout her entire life with maybe one short gap after her husband passed away. And it's that consistency and that effort and persistence that have really paid out for her. But I think another thing that I came across was in the Moma archives, there was actually a show that was put together where Carmen was considered but eventually left out, and they had a biography of hers from like 1974. And it stated that her work was in 3 public institutions, el Museo de La Habana, el Museo de Santiago de Cuba, and in the collection of the Cintas Foundation, as well as private collections in New York, Toronto, Paris, Madrid, and Havana. So I think it's important for living artists to hear this, that it doesn't happen overnight and that you don't have to wait until you're 90, and that small recognitions for your work are really valuable, even if it's not the grand show at the Whitney when you're over 100.
Yeah, and I mean, I want to continue to look at some of these installation images from El Museo because they really are stunning. And I think that there's, I mean, as you were saying, Carolina, these are sort of the ginger between her.
I think it's fantastic if Tony could speak about, because some of the things that I really liked about Carmen's sense of humor, that she has like this sort of self-deprecating humor, where she always made fun of the fact that she was discovered, you know, at such a late age. And so I think it'd be interesting if you talked a bit about that, because yes, she has been, you know, she has had the recognition finally that she deserves, but she still lived a full life, as you say, Monica, that didn't really, you know, didn't depend on whether she achieved this or not. I mean, we're all happy that she did, but I like her sense of humor in relation to that.
As she always said, she was quoted in a German magazine, and I was there for the interview, and it really, a light bulb lit over my head. She said that being ignored is a form of freedom. Mm-hmm. She said, I couldn't care less what anybody said. I was going to do what I wanted to do. And if my time was not right, or if it wasn't to be accepted, you know, so the hell with it. And Jessie encouraged that. You know, she never hesitated with her work, and they couldn't afford to build estructuras, but she said no. Whenever she said that she wanted to take a job or something, she said, no, you're a painter and you just stay on painting. I think it's interesting to note that, you know, she was discovered many times, and she had retrospectives many times, including at the old Alternative Museum. I don't know if any of you remember that. Yes. When it existed in
87, no, was that show?
It was 87, yep.
Yeah. I had a show there, and the Alternative Museum, and which was the first cultural institution in Tribeca. when Tribeca was abandoned. And then she had a mid-career retrospective. And every time she had one of these shows, and she had several, the New York Times, Grace Gluck, Holland Cutter, many other, would always single her out, mention, and say, wondering how come this person was not better known. You know, in 2004 and 5, during the Latin Collector, and when the famous dinner that I had with Federico Seve, in which he told me that he had advertised for 3 geometric painters, Mira Schendel, Monica, who were the other ones?
Fanny Sanin.
Fanny, yes, of course. And then the third one dropped out. And I said, oh, no, don't worry, because I'm going to introduce you to someone who fits that category to a T. And she was included in the 2004 show in Latin Collector. And that time it caught on. Now, I have been asked many times, why then, and why not in 85, why not in 98, why not in the Artist Space. He also had a show at the Artist Space that was very well received. And well, the phenomenon is that there was such a thing as a women collectors in 2004. Besides Peggy Guggenheim and a couple of others, there was collectors and museum directors were all men. But all of a sudden, there was such a thing as a women collector. Not that they were collecting work by women necessarily, but the fact that Carmen's first 4 or 5 paintings that she sold really in the market for a reasonable price, and all 4 or 5 of them were women collectors. I don't want to mention one of them because then I have to mention all of them, and then I'm going to forget. But so the climate changed, the culture changed, and as the culture changed, it was more acceptable and more recognizable. Her path was noted.
Tony, I kind of want to, I hope you don't mind if I interject, but on that note, and I also want to note that we're a little bit running out of time. So if you have questions for the panelists that you want to add to the chat so we can make sure we get to them. But I think this sentiment that you're bringing up about the role of women, not only Carmen, but also collectors, curators.
That's right.
Well, Carolina and Monica and myself, I've been thinking a lot about it. Also because we have the show on view right now, Zelia Sanchez, and coincidentally both Carmen and Zelia had been included in this exhibition in 2016 called The Elusive Eye that you see on screen. Also another exhibition that preceded my time here at El Museo, but was an exhibition of works from El Museo's collection of all women artists that was held offsite at the Hunter East Harlem Gallery. What can we do, you know, as women, or you don't have to be a woman, but as curators to try and turn this over so that we don't continue to have Carmen's or Zelia's. I mean, Monica, you just mentioned Fanny Sanin. We have a work by Raquel Rabinovitz that we see on the screen here. Are there other artists that either of you see as, you know, meriting this kind of attention? How is your own work thinking about some of this? Or obviously, Carolina, you did the Beatriz Gonzalez show soon after the Carmen Herrera show, another pioneering exhibition at El Museo.
Yes, and then also after the Beatriz Gonzalez show, another 20 years passed before she had her following retrospective exhibition in the US. So, yeah.
I don't know, in terms of my own work, I really make it a priority, and I try to consciously make an effort to do research and publish about female artists. The last person that I worked seriously on was Maria Belén Marmolejo, who is an artist from Cali, who was very important in terms of starting performance art in Colombia. And even though she had a short-lived practice, I think it was pivotal for the reception of that in Colombia. And I think it's important to note that Carmen was actually in Women Choose Women in 1973. It was one of the very first shows that was exclusively juried by critics and curators who were female, and only inviting female artists. So it is a very long time in the making. And I think it has to be a concerted effort on the part of everyone, not just females. Yeah.
Well, you know, the bubble of protectionism that the New York art world had has popped, and now it's out there. And I think that there will be many more opportunities to women artists or marginalized artists or artists who are not had the New York seal of approval. Because I am convinced that 40s, 50s, and 60s in New York, you could not make a move in the art world unless you made it in New York. And New York was very jealously guarding this post-war position that they had inherited as the center of the art world. And they, unless a foreign artist, and I can mention 30 or 40 or 50, was here in New York. And in the case of Latin Americans, I can tell you of the three, of Soto, of Le Parc, and of Cruz Diez, who were in Paris. They made a tactical choice to go to Paris instead of coming to New York, and therefore they were not really household names until the last 5 or 7 years or 10 years. But you know, I don't want, if the time is really coming up, I want to make sure that I give you a message from Carmen. I had lunch with her today. She's well. She's totally protected from the pandemic. She still has her great sense of humor. She draws every morning. Today when I was there, she had a therapist. She was doing her exercises, and I asked her if she wanted for us to have this in her house, in her home, and she just didn't feel like it. She said, "It's not my birthday anyway," which is true. Her birthday, she has 2 birthdays. The Cuban passport says her birthday is Saturday, and the American passport says the birthday is Sunday. So, but anyway, she's very grateful. She's eternally grateful to El Museo, and she has told me that many times. And to Carolina, she's grateful that, I'm glad that Monica is participating, because she considers Monica a personal friend. And Monica and her family a personal friend. And she wanted for me to express my gratitude. And she was very annoyed by this virus that she doesn't understand is going on, is affecting some of her more interesting projects, you know, that were supposed to be happening, like the Royal Ballet in London, like an exhibit at the Mori Museum in Tokyo, which apparently is going to happen, but it's been postponed. And I'm sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, I will say, we are supposed to have an ARTE HORA, and we are at an HORA right now. But I want to, if our panelists will agree, to extend maybe for 5 minutes, because we are getting some questions that I hope, if you don't mind, we can address. One question was about Carmen's relationship to the concrete artists of Cuba in 1950, and related to that, Why was Carmen not included in the 1943 Moma exhibition of Cuban artists? And I know, Monica, since I've been rereading your chronology avidly, some of that has been discussed there. So maybe you can start that?
Sure, I can speak to the 1944 exhibition maybe in the fact that Carmen was not included, I think for two reasons. And one is that all of the artists who were included in that show, there's 13 of them, were all based in Havana. And at this point, she had already been gone for 4 years, but she actually happened to be in Havana at the time. And she brought back a painting of Fidelio Ponce that was included in the show, and she hand gave it to Alfred Barr when she returned from her trip in Havana. And Ponce was a family friend too. And Fidelio. And so I think it's also the only woman included was Amelia Peláez, who at that point had a lot of recognition. So,
well, you know, the great anecdote on that is that when they went, they had a painting not only from Fidelio Ponce, but from Wilfredo Lam, that they transported from Cuba to New York to deliver to Alfred Barr. And during the whole conversation, Barr kept referring to Jessie as Carmen and to Carmen as Jessie. Because, you know, Carmen is also, especially an Italian name. And when Carmen walked out of that meeting, she knew that, you know, this man had really absolutely no knowledge or interest in who she was. He even had her name mixed up.
It's also interesting that her friend Wilfredo Lam wasn't included in that show either, as were a number of other artists on various technicalities.
When Wilfredo Lam came to New York, she would use Carmen's studio as a telephone exchange. That's where the messages would come in, and Carmen used to take it. And Carmen used to transport from Havana to New York and to Paris works by Lam. So it's no surprise that she was not in. Remember, in the relationship to the other, Lolo Soldevilla was a good friend, but Lolo was already, Carmen was already in Paris. Carmen had left Havana already 10 or 12 years before. Saint Dudarier had not arrived at the scene until, what was it, 45 or 46? I'm not sure. Monica, can you help me?
I think it was a little earlier, like 44.
44. So Carmen was already in New York. So her contact, her interactions with that movement, the Cuban movement, that's the reason why they were just not in touch. There was a war going on. It was very difficult to travel. It was incredibly difficult to communicate. So in a way, Carmen was always in the wrong place at the wrong time until recently.
I agree with that.
But you know, one of the reasons, people also ask me about her longevity. What is the reason for her longevity? Well, she always looks at the glass. She always looks at the half full part. She doesn't look at the half empty. I once asked her, Carmen, did you ever consider when you were depressed going to a psychiatrist or psychoanalyst, as they were so popular in New York in the 60s, like they are in Buenos Aires? And she looked at me and she said, depressed? I was never depressed. I said, but Carmen, you know, you were turned down here, turned down there. He said, no, you know, I was free to do what I wanted. I was doing what I wanted. I had a great relationship with a man who was super intelligent and interesting. And she had no regrets. And she has no regrets. She actually sometimes looks at this, her recognition of so-called quotation marks fame, and she gets a little annoyed at it, you know, like, oh, you know, too late. But she enjoys it.
Well, and I think
She will enjoy watching this.
yes. Well,
If she's already doing it, I'm not sure. She'll complain about my hair being too short or too long or something. She always has something to complain about. So the reason for her longevity. For 100 years, you drink scotch and eat red meat. Then when you hit 100, you become a vegetarian and you drink champagne, which is what she's done. She's now a vegetarian because, since she was 99 or 100. So the key to longevity is that live 100, drinking scotch, and then switch to champagne at 100.
Well, Tony, I think thinking about champagne is maybe a perfect way for us to end. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but thank you all for being here tonight. As Tony said, her actual birthday is on May 30th, so I hope maybe this...
Oh, wait. Her actual Cuban passport is May 30th. The American passport is May 31st.
Well, then we have an excuse to drink to Carmen twice this weekend. And I wanted to thank all of our panelists for being here. I think we can all, we could continue talking about Carmen and her life and her contributions, well, hopefully for another 100 years. So I wanted to thank you all for being here, and Feliz cumpleaños, Carmen. Thank you, Carolina. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Tony. And thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Susanna.
Bye, Monica.
Bye.
Go crazy in Orlando. Can you go to Disney World? No.
No, they're not open yet.
Tony, I'm happy to see you.
Oh, it's wonderful to see you, Carolina.
Quiero abrazar.
You were a star for us in that Enfoco series and the S for el Museo del Barrio, I'd say. I don't know. I think you made a mistake going to Los Angeles, or to San Francisco, huh? Was it San Francisco?
San Francisco.
Yeah, no, you did a good job.
Shoulda, coulda, woulda.
It's great to see you, darling.
Te quiero.
Igualmente.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Adiós,
Thank
te quiero.
you all.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.